And now 11, knight takes f7. This is the brilliant tactical shot that Daniil Dubov used to moke Hans Niemann, the future world champion, in this insane game from their recent 20-game blitz match that they played last month in May 2025. But let's rewind all the way to the beginning. Daniil Dubov opening 1d4 in this game. Hans Niemann, knight f6, then c4, e6, knight f3, and then d5, the good old-fashioned QGD. This is all the rage these days with white and with black. Now here, Daniil, he's a huge expert in the Catalan Opening with the move 4g3, and this is pretty much all he played as white in the recent one-on-one blitz match. Now here, Hans Niemann, he goes bishop b4, giving the king a check on the e1 square, and here, most white players will play the move bishop d2. That is by far the main line here. But Daniil Dubov, he is a huge expert in this sideline with the move knight bd2. And honestly, after watching his games from this match, it's not really obvious that this move knight bd2 is any weaker than the alternative bishop d2. And I think we will start seeing a lot more of this move from other top grandmasters. All right, Hans Niemann, castles is the move. And here white goes bishop g2, and Hans Niemann now has a big choice to make. Do you want to take on c4? Do you want to go c5? Do you want to go a5? Do you want to go b6? What is it going to be? Well, Hans Niemann in this match, he mostly played the move b6, intending bishop b7. From here, white castles, black goes bishop b7, and now here Daniil goes knight e5, jumping up with his knight and temporarily stopping the idea of d takes c4 from black. Obviously, if you take that pawn is poisoned, then white would win the bishop and the rook on the a8 square and effectively win the game on the spot. So obviously, Hans Niemann, being a future world champion, he will not fall for that trick. All right, instead, the move here for Hans is a5, a solid move. You defend the bishop. That way, if white ever goes, for example, queen b3 or queen to a4 in the future, then that bishop is already defended on the b4 square in advance. And beyond that, a5 is just a useful move in general. There are a lot of different scenarios where black wants the move a5 played. For example, if white goes, I don't know, a3, driving back the bishop, then black already controls b4, dissuading white from going b4, expanding on the queen side. So in general, just a useful general move here for black. Now, Daniil, queen to c2 is the move, getting the queen to a pretty solid square overall. It defends c4, it pressures e4, and so on. Just a good general square for the queen. Now, Hans Niemann, what should he be doing in this exact position? Well, it turns out the standard QGD pawn break, that being c5, is excellent here. If black simply plays c5, he will have a great game. For example, c5, c takes d5, bishop takes, and from there, Hans Niemann would be very, very close to equal. He'd have pretty much full equality and zero issues in the game. But instead, Hans, I'm not sure if he's mixing his lines up or what's happening because he plays the move rook to e8. Now, this move in general in many openings is very common. For example, if white were to go a3, black can go bishop f8, retreating the bishop and getting it back to a good square. However, this move right here, with the knight on the e5 square, this rook is very misplaced because white is going to have the idea of taking on f7 later in the game, and that could be very hard to deal with. All right, here, Daniil, knight d to f3 is the move. He's got very good piece coordination. His knights on e5 and f3 make a very, very good impression. Now, Hans here, in this position, I don't know what he's thinking. He takes on c4. D takes c4. I guess the idea is, with the knight on f3 instead of d2, the bishop is blocked, and therefore there is no taking on b7 tactical shot. However, Daniil, he finds an even better idea for white. You simply take on f7. Knight takes f7, and Hans, it's only 11 moves into the game, and already he's getting simply moked in this game. I mean, if you don't know, moke is where Hans Niemann defeats a player in spectacular fashion, but I guess here Hans Niemann is the one being moked himself. All right, black, what should he be doing here? If he takes the knight, obviously the idea is knight to e5, hitting the king, and also hitting the bishop on b7. You win the bishop and effectively the game. So black here, he really can't take the knight, but if you don't take the knight, then you have to move the queen out of the attack. Hans Niemann, he does that. Queen to e7 is the move. And now we have a3. Instead of moving this knight back to, say, e5, white pushes back the bishop on the b4 square. Now black goes bishop d6, retreating. White takes on d6. Black takes back. and then queen takes c4. So the dust has settled, and Daniil here, he's simply up a pawn, that being the pawn on f7. Now, black is still doing somewhat okay, but keep in mind, in the long run, that extra pawn is going to make a massive difference in this game. I mean, first of all, a pawn is a pawn, but second of all, black's pawns on e6 and d6 are both super, super weak now. For example, if black had a pawn on f7, then the pawn on e6 would be defended, but right now, it is not, and black is in a lot of trouble. All right, Hans Niemann, the future world champion. Knight bd7 is the move. Then we have bishop g5, pinning that knight on f6 to the queen on the e7 square, a solid move, and overall, a solid square for the bishop. Now, black here goes rook e to c8, challenging the queen. White goes back to d3, a good square in general. And now black does go h6, putting the question to the bishop. Do you want to take on f6? And it turns out Daniil says, yes, I do. He simply takes on f6. Now, normally, you don't want to give up your bishop pair that easily. After all, white here has those two Bs. Those two Bs on g2 and g5 are very, very strong, very important. However, here, Daniil says, you know what? I'm already up the pawn. In the endgame, I'm going to have a massive advantage. Therefore, I can simply trade off some pieces, and as more pieces come off the board, my material advantage will be bigger and bigger. Now, Daniil, rook f to c1, not a very complicated move, challenging black's control of the open c file. And what is Hans going to do? Well, he dives in with the bishop, bishop to e4, not a bad idea at all, and a very thematic idea for various lines of the Catalan Opening. All right, the bishop challenges the queen. Where is the queen going to go? It goes to the e3 square, a pretty good square for the queen. It maintains tension on the bishop. And of course, the knight now cannot move to, say, d5 or g4, as you would lose that very important piece. Instead, Hans Niemann, queen to b7. Actually, a pretty good square for the queen. The queen and the bishop make this little mini battery on the long diagonal. Now, if white were to go, say, knight to d2, he would lose the bishop and therefore the game. Instead, Daniil here, bishop to h3, a very creative move. He's basically saying, I'm going to abandon this long diagonal and instead pressure the very weak pawn on e6, and black has to defend. In the game, Hans, king to f7, the king does defend that square, but this is a very committal move. The king now is a little more exposed, and there may be some sort of knight g5 or knight e5 idea later in the game hitting the king. Now, Daniil, knight d2 is the move. Perfect piece coordination. He moves the bishop. First, he brings that light squared bishop off g2, where it won't be under attack, and then he drops back and drives back the bishop. Now, black goes to d5 with the bishop, a decent idea, and then we have queen to f4. The queen gets out of the way of the e-pawn, and now white is technically threatening e4, and then e5 with the attack on the pin piece, that being the knight. Already, we're seeing the drawbacks of having the king on the f7 square, and Hans Niemann, he has to respond in the game. He takes on c1 with the rook. Rook takes c1, white takes back, and then rook to c8. The other rook enters the game on the c8 square. Now here, white goes rook e1, keeping the rook alive, and now renewing the threat of e4 and then e5. Now black goes g5, a very committal idea, and honestly, not a bad practical idea. The point being, Hans, if he just sits around and waits, he's going to get blown off the board. Therefore, he's trying to make some sort of counterplay on the king side, maybe intending g4, driving back that bishop, maybe getting some sort of attack. Not the worst idea, but the problem is, in the process, he gives up the pawn on d6. Queen takes d6 is the move. Hans Niemann, he's all in. He's down 2 pawns here. He's getting moped so far in this game. g4 is the move, driving back that bishop. Now, it has to go back. It goes back to the f1 square, bishop to f1, and then rook to c2. The rook flies in to the second rank. Hans Niemann playing a pretty decent game of chess if you ignore the opening moves 8, 9, and 10, leading to 11, knight takes f7. Now from here, queen to f4. The queen drops back, pressures g4, pins the knight to the king, a solid overall move. The queen did its job on d6, gobbling up that pawn, and now it simply drops back and asks Hans Niemann, what are you going to do, buddy? All right, black, queen c7 is the move, offering the queen trade, and Daniil, he ignores the queen and takes the pawn. Now, he's simply up, let's see, 1, 2, 3 pawns on the king side. Daniil, 3 pawns? Hans, what are you doing in this game? All right, Hans, rook c1, offering the rook trade, and we do have the trade. rook takes, and then queen to f4. The queen just gobbling up these pawns and then instantly going back to the f4 square each time. A very simple but very effective strategy. And right now, almost everything is defended. Yes, the pawn on b2 is under attack. Yes, it could be lost, but overall, Daniil getting a very, very simple, good game. And keep in mind, e4, then e5 is still being threatened. For example, if black takes on b2, then bang, e4 and tending e5 wins the knight, and white wins the game. So instead, here, Hans, king to e7 is the move, getting out of the attack, out of the pin of the queen. Now we have e4 all the same, bishop takes, and then queen to g5, pinning the knight once again. Black goes back to d5, bishop d5, and then we have knight to e4, offering the queen trade, but also attacking the knight, and therefore virtually forcing the move, queen takes g5, and then knight takes. Daniil getting what he wants, a very simple edge in the endgame with the 4 pawns on the king side, roughly the king side, versus the 2 pawns of Hans Niemann. All right, now we have knight to e8. The knight drops back, bishop e2, pressures the pawn on g4, and then king to f6. Now we have h4, defends the knight, g takes h3, wins the pawn and attacks the knight again, and knight takes. Now knight d6, knight f4, knight f5, and here the Russian Grandmaster simply trades on d5, entering a completely winning endgame. Now, Hans Niemann, the future world champion, to his credit, he's down, but he's not out. He's still fighting in this game, despite having a completely losing position, and so far getting completely moked. Now here we have bishop d3, knight takes d4, and then f4. The pawns are now rolling down the board. Now we have b5, king f2, b4, a takes, and g4. Daniil, all he has to do is push these pawns down the board and secure the victory. We have knight to e6, g5 hits the king to e7, king e3, king d6, and then bishop f1. The bishop drops back and eyes the h3 square, where it will pressure this diagonal. Now we have knight c5, g6, king e7, the king drops back, trying to defend against these pawns, and then f5, the pawns continue their march down the board. Now king to f6, king d4, white ignores this pawn and instead counterattacks on the knight. We have knight to a4, b3, knight c3, and then bishop d3, defends the pawn, and white right here has the entire board basically on lockdown. Black goes king g7, and here the final move of the game, king to e5, Daniil Dubov intending f6, then, for example, king e6, f7, and so on. Daniil is simply winning here. The computer says mate in 13 moves, and finally, Hans Niemann, the world champion, he admits he has been moked in this game, and he resigns on the spot to Daniil Dubov. Wow, what a game by Daniil, the Russian Grandmaster, starting with the move 11, knight takes f7, a beautiful but very simple tactical shot that for some reason Hans Niemann, despite being a future world champion, he missed the simple idea in this game. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. I'm very curious, are you guys Hans Niemann fans, or do you hate the guy? I mean, it seems like everyone is on one side of the spectrum. Personally, despite the jokes in this video, I quite like the guy, and I'm actually rooting for him and his new platform, endgame.ai. Check it out if you want. But yeah, I personally, despite the jokes in this video, I'm actually very, very supportive of the guy. So, you know, go ahead and follow him. Check out his endgame.ai if you want, and comment down below what you think of the guy and, you know, all of that. But anyways, that is all for today. Smash that YouTube like button if you can, and I will see you in the next video.